Hi, welcome students, Franklin University, HCM 830, Economics of Healthcare Organizations. I thought I'd do a chapter 5 overview. This is a very important chapter in the book. I trust that all of you are grappling through the chapters. That's really the only way to learn the content is to read and grapple through the reading. I know it's tough, but I promise you, if you grapple through it, you will learn what it is that you're supposed to learn from this course, and you'll be able to integrate that seamlessly into your dissertation and also have some deliverables for your everyday work as well. So look to incorporate these principles on your job right away and into your dissertation, but you're not going to be able to do any of those unless you truly grapple with the content. So please forgive me for how informal this may be, but it's just good that we just kind of go through it. So we're on chapter 5, healthcare production and cost. And what I really want you to know before we get started is economists think about economics in two phases, in the short run and in the long run. So when we look at changes in the production formula or the cost formula or changes to the inputs or the outputs, you can think about it in what happens in the short run. And depending on the time frame, that short run could be anywhere from a year or less. And when we look at the long run, we are usually looking at a year or more. So if you have to make changes, and what are the effects on those changes, or what is the logic behind those changes? Well, we can think about it in terms of the short-term effects and the long-term effects. And I think it's good to see that anything is possible in the long run, whereas we may have more constraints in the short run. So on chapter 5 in the introduction, the author really talks about how we're going to talk about the relationship between inputs and outputs. And when we look at these combinations, meaning that the more that you can manipulate the inputs or the various alternatives to the input, then that could affect the levels of the output. For example, if we're looking at, let's say, the delivery of medical services or medical care, on the input side, we could have a medical doctor, a doctor of osteopathic medicine, a nurse practitioner, a physician assistant, a nursing assistant, a medical assistant. We could have allied health professionals, specialists. So these are all of the inputs that, depending on that mix, will affect the level of outputs. And when we talk about outputs in health services, we're really measuring outcomes, aren't we? Outcomes from clinical interventions, outcomes from pharmacological interventions. And so, just look to kind of marry the language. What is technology? I love this definition. It's under section 5.2, and it's really an easy way to think about technology as being a way of transforming inputs into outputs. Now, when we usually think of technology, we try to put it in some type of context. We say medical technology, such as the advent of MRI machines or other advanced imaging machines or medical diagnostic machines or medical devices, perhaps, that or when we think of computer technology, we think of the latest processor power or the latest software. But technology, in its most generic sense, is anything that will transform an input to an output. So when we talk about production in medical care, or when we talk about production in the terms of medical services, then we're really looking at medical care. And so there are many different technologies even for the same illness. Think about it for a minute. I mean, we're in the age of COVID-19, and we already know that there's three different types of vaccinations that scientists use that can um, lead to that same outcome, which is to give you some type of immunity against the COVID-19 illness there. Or if you think about the common cold or any other type of conditions, there's usually multiple technologies to treat that same illness. So when we talk about technologies, these technologies can be divided into two groups according to the author: your fixed and your variable inputs. So fixed inputs are those that are restricted to the current function and time under consideration and cannot be varied even in the current production. So whether we're talking about long term or short term, your fixed inputs will always be the same. Whether your patient flow is 10 or whether your patient flow is 110, your fixed inputs will not change. However, your variable inputs are actually will change, right? Because depending on your patient flow, the variable inputs will, meaning that you'll need more inputs when you see 10 patients compared to when you treat 110 patients. So again, usually when we talk about that period of fixed, we're talking about less than 1 year, similar to the way that we look at the short run or the short term, if you will. And usually when we talk about production time, as it relates to, let's say, physicians rendering care or any of the allied staff rendering care, we time box that into a 40-hour work week. That way we can level the playing field. Sometimes you'll hear economists say all things being equal. Well, in this case, all things being equal is a 40-hour work week, no matter what input we're talking about. Input coming from an MD, a DO, a PA, a NP, or any other type of factor there, or any other type of input. So the variable factor of production, in this case, we're going to talk about nursing time and how much nursing time can either substitute or complement physician time. And there's three types of tasks that we're going to look at, which are administrative tasks, technical tasks, and then the examination itself. By the way, I'm still on section 5.2 for anyone that is following along in the book. So our assumptions is that physicians can treat all patients that require to be treated, and that there are no limitations on the physician's time that would create a problem of capacity, or in this case, we can look at it as a constraint. But since it is not a constraint in our assumptions here, we don't have to include that in our economic equation. Speaking of our economic equation, that would be Q, and that's the measure of quality as determined by the patients, equal Q times L times F, where L refers to the nurse's time, Q refers to the quality as measured by the patient, and F is the fixed output. So the production function is a summary of what goes into the process, i.e. the input, and what comes out of the process, i.e. the output. So with W being F for fixed, only L can be varied. So think about it, right? Because we already determined that your fixed input is going to be the same whether you see one patient or whether you see 100 patients, right? The quality, in this case, we'll have to say is subjective because it's measured by the patient. Uh, Perhaps it would be objective if it was monitored by a medical team or by a physician that could objectively measure it. And so then the only variable in this case would be L, and that is the nurse's time in that transaction. And if you want to see a clearer picture of that, go ahead and look at table 5.1, which is the relationship between the cost and the output. And you'll notice there that you'll have 10 columns and you'll see varying degrees of outputs based on the column one, which is the total nursing hours there. So the additional production yield by the use of one extra unit of variable input is called the marginal product, and it can be expressed in the formula of delta Q divided by delta L. Now, let's talk about this whole idea of marginal, because we'll talk about that throughout the rest of this chapter overview. And it's a recurring theme in economics. We're always looking at the marginal effects of one extra unit of production, one extra unit of input, one extra unit of output, and how that affects the economic formula. And so usually when we make assumptions or when we make forecasts, it's always going to be based on the marginal yield or the marginal output, which is really another way of saying, what if we wanted one extra of whatever it is that we're measuring, an hour of production, an extra hamburger, an extra output of a car on a production facility, for example. So under figure 5.3, the production function illustrates the relationship between the number of nursing hours and the amount of total output produced in terms of physician visits. And so if we look at the y-axis, the y-axis is the quality of outputs. And if we look at the x-axis is the quantity of inputs as measured by nursing hours. And so as we see the more nursing hours, such as in figure 5.1 for 140 nursing hours, we should be able to see approximately 10 and a half patients. Now, some of you may be thinking about this and you're wondering, well, what does this all really mean? Or how does this translate into the real world? And let me tell you how this is. And hopefully I haven't told this before, but I was doing some consulting for an ambulatory organization that had actually expanded from Southern California into Michigan and into Washington State. And one of the issues that I was faced with earlier was there was this medication that was very expensive, but it had to sit on the shelf and be ready for the medical team to be able to use it. And so part of what we had to figure out was an economic equation for them to order just enough of that medication, because remember, it was very expensive to be sitting on the shelf waiting for a physician or medical staff to administer that to inpatients. And that's not the only example. I would imagine hospitals have certain economic equations that will determine how much of their house medication or formulary medication needs to be in stock and waiting for physicians to administer that to patients. When we look at places like Walmart, for example, or Toyota that use the old Kazan system, which is just-in-time inventory, meaning that if your inventory says that you should have 3 on the shelf and 1 or even 2 of them went to the production line, then that would automatically trigger a reorder, and hopefully those replacement parts would show up the next day and get you back to your inventory levels. But the whole idea of understanding the relationships between the inputs and the outputs is so that you can have enough of whatever your input is that will ultimately affect your output. But at the same time, you're not going to have a whole bunch of money sitting on the shelf for the medication to either expire or just be sitting there when you could use that money for other purposes. Remember, in economics, we live in a world of scarcity. We live in a world of economic costs. And so with the scarcity of funding or revenue that you have to make choices on how you're going to allocate that revenue. So under section 5.2 there, we talk about the shift now in the production curve based on the nursing hours. And we determine here that the marginal product will eventually decline as more units of the variable input are added. So what does that mean? That means that with more nursing hours that we add, the actual utility or the quality, and remember that quality is perceived by the patient, will decline. And that's an idea. We haven't talked about that much yet, but that's the idea of marginal utility, meaning at some point, your inputs are going to be so high that you have a diminishing return for it. Let me give you a very simple example. Think of whatever your favorite food is, your favorite, maybe dessert or something. Perhaps it's cheesecake. And that first piece of cheesecake is probably the best cheesecake that you've ever had. Well, what happens? Maybe it's your birthday and you get a second piece of cheesecake. Okay, well, probably the first half of the second piece of cheesecake is pretty good. But once you start getting through that second piece and lo and behold, a third piece of cheesecake comes around, you now have a diminishing return, meaning that third piece of cheesecake is no longer as satisfying as that first piece of cheesecake is. So what is the marginal unit that will trigger your utility being diminished by that cheesecake? For me, it probably would be the third piece of cheesecake, but for you, maybe it's the second piece of cheesecake. And so, so when we look at it in terms of healthcare, right, or the delivery of healthcare, then we look at the patient mix, or in this case, the case mix of the hospital or the ambulatory center. We look at the severity of the patient injuries. We look at the quality of the care. We look at the use of technology, and we look at the capital allocation. So those are variables that you should be considering for your dissertation, and the effects of whatever programmatic change or programmatic analysis or recommendations or interventions that you have. Think about economically, how does that affect the health system? And then here at the bottom, I love here when it says that sometimes the introduction of a new piece of, we'll say, medical equipment can increase the quantity of the output without changing the quality of it. Again, I'm going to use some simple examples here. I think many of you may be familiar with the story of Ray Kroc and McDonald's, or the McDonald brothers that started what we know as McDonald's, as a single restaurant there in Southern California. I believe it's Downey, California. How Ray Kroc was a person that sold shakes. And the shakes were so popular there in this little one store that was coming out of Southern California that Mr. Kroc had to eventually go see what was going on out there in Southern California, eventually became the sole owner proprietor of McDonald's. And, we kind of know the rest, but I'm saying all of that to say McDonald's has some very popular shakes. So when Ray Kroc came in with his shake machine, it allowed them to produce more milkshakes, but it didn't actually change the quality of the milkshake. And we see that with medical devices and in healthcare. So it's possible to bring in new technology, but that new technology doesn't necessarily improve the quality of the outcome, i.e. the output. Now, my theory is, and you have seen these reports too, on how much the United States spends on medical care and medical technology. Yet when we look at mortality rates and other types of quality indicators, the U.S. is middle of the pack at best, but usually trailing most countries. So that would be a perfect case where just introducing new technology doesn't necessarily improve the outcome. And that's something you want to think about too when you are creating, crafting, editing, and then eventually publishing your research. So when we look at, I'm in section 5.2 here, and we're looking at the relationship of volume versus outcome, kind of in that second paragraph towards the bottom of the page there. And the whole idea is that as care teams and as physicians perform more of the same medical procedures, their skills are better when they perform multiple procedures over a specific period of time. And as a result of that, the quality of the output should be enhanced. And if you think about that, and if anyone's read Malcolm Broadwell's book, what is the name of that book there? Where he talks about 10,000 hours and how it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert at anything that you want to do. There's an underlying economic principle there that we're really trying to unpack here in section 5.2, which is the more that the care team performs, or the specialty team performs these repeated procedures over a finite period of time, then we can look at the quality of the output being much higher. So we would therefore expect a positive relationship between the volume of a given procedure for a given practitioner or the team and the outputs of the care that was provided. And that kind of makes sense intuitively, doesn't it? You don't really even need to be an economist to understand that. Section 5.3. So we're going to talk about now the short run costs versus the output relationship. And specifically, we're looking at production cost. And so for a provider, a cost is the value of the input used in the production process. I know it took me getting a master's degree to really understand how this whole cost equation works in healthcare. And some of you still may be grappling with that. I mean, think about it for a minute. You have a physician. Why don't we say we use MRI services? So you have a physician that performs MRIs, and they have determined that the price for the MRI is $500. Well, let's talk about the payer mix a little bit, because depending on the payer mix will depend on how much that person gets reimbursed. For example, if one of those MRI procedures are on a self-paid patient, a self-pay patient, they can expect that full $500 from that self-pay patient. Maybe the next patient is a PPO or an EPO patient. And so perhaps they will also expect the full $500. And then we start getting into HMOs, or we start getting into people that have public health insurance like Medicare and Medicaid. And then we start to see the lowering of the reimbursement. So now all of a sudden for a Medicaid patient, the physician performs an MRI at $500. The federal government says, well, we only reimburse $400 for MRIs. And when you get your electronic remittance, you only receive $350 for your MRI. So that's a $150 difference between what the physician values the procedure at and what the payer ultimately reimbursed them at. So again, getting back to that statement for the provider, the cost is the value of the inputs in the production process. So a broader view of the costs, one measure that what a provider gives up by using all the resources committed to the production, not just the ones paid for. Another way of putting it is that the cost of the resource is measured by the amount for which the resource can be sold in the market, or the market value of the resource, which is in production. And that's kind of where you get that gray area on how in the world are these physicians reimbursed, or how can they maintain a viable business. I mean, think about that for a minute, right? Because healthcare is very unique in that way. What if you were to go to your favorite department store or your favorite store, and they have a ticket price on an item for $1,000, and you go up and you say, I know that this ticket price is $100 or $1,000, excuse me, but we only want to pay $750 for it. Well, if the item isn't on sale and they sell it to you for $750, then that's a $250 loss of profit. So how can any business maintain viability in a situation like that, let alone a hospital or a medical clinic or an ambulatory surgical center? So no answers right now, but those are things that you should be thinking about as you're coming up with your recommendations and as you're coming up with your possibilities. Make sure that they are realistic and that they are rooted in the real economics of the organization. That's the purpose of this course. We've only got a couple more examples here. I know we're running long, so thank you very much for your time. And so in section 5.3, it talks about total cost is the sum of all of the costs incurred in the production of a given level of output. And that formula consists of your total variable costs, which are the total costs of variable inputs at any level of outputs, and your total fixed costs, which is the total cost of all of your fixed factors. The total cost is the sum of the total of the variable costs and the total fixed costs. Now, remember from our discussion earlier, those fixed costs aren't going to change based on the output. So if you're looking at, let's say, electricity or water in your hospital, well, technically, some of that could be very costs. Because you could potentially run more electricity or more water. But I want you to, and actually those are examples of fixed costs, which are utilities. So think about that, how your costs are going to be the same your fixed costs, but your variable costs will rise based on your patient flow or based on your case mix or some other type of variables. So the behavior of the total variable cost depends on two factors: the relationship between the output and the variable inputs. And you can see an example of that in section 5.2, where all of the unit cost and the variable cost are resourced in figure 5.3. So the total cost, remember, the fixed cost, does not vary with the output level. And you can see that in section 5.3. So your fixed cost is that straight line there. And your variable cost, again, will rise based on your level of output. So kind of finally here, and we have two more sections, but kind of finally, I want you to pay special attention to section 5.3.3, which are marginal cost. And we talked about that a little bit, right? So the marginal cost is the cost that it would take to produce one extra level of output. And in this case, we're talking about medical care. But humor me for a minute. What if we were talking about burgers and the restaurant produced 100 burgers a day at a specific fixed cost and at a specific variable cost? But now they want to produce one extra burger. And remember, when we talk about marginal anything, we're always talking about one extra unit. So in this case, how much would it cost the burger joint to produce one extra burger, 101 burgers? Well, we already know that the fixed cost isn't going to change whether they produce 100 burgers or 150 burgers. So we're really looking at the variable cost of producing that one extra burger. So that would be perhaps the variable cost of the bun, of the burger patty, of the condiments, if you will, that would go on the burger, the wrapping, if you will, and the production cost of making the burger and then delivering that burger to the customer, if you will. So in addition to the cost required to move one extra unit higher on the output scale, the formula is the delta of the total cost divided by the delta of the quality. Remember, the total fixed cost is constant over all levels of output, and the marginal fixed cost would be at zero at any value. So simply the addition to the total variable cost needed to produce one extra unit of output. However, because of the diminishing marginal productivity of variable inputs, coupled with the additional variable inputs, requires successively greater resource commitment. So what does that all mean? Well, if we look at the curve here in figure 5.4, then that starts to be a little clearer, right? Because now we look at the relationship between the cost and the output. So the concept of marginal cost is central to the analysis of economic decisions, because the types of decisions that concern economists involve determining the consequences of employing additional or fewer resources for a particular purpose, meaning that is it worth it to the burger joint to have the extra costs associated with producing the one extra burger, or does the diminishing marginal utility take away from the incentive to produce the extra burger? meaning that in some cases, or actually in all cases, uh, managers and economists and producers have to make the tough decision on when to cut the production cycle. I look at Tesla, for example, Tesla, which is, my dream car. And I know some of you are probably driving Tesla. So congratulations. I certainly want to be like you when I grow up. And for me, it would seem like everyone would want a Tesla. So why isn't Tesla producing 350 million cars? Okay. So you've learned so much about the course where you have automatically said, because there's no demand for the cars, Dr. D, and you're absolutely right. But we do know that there is more demand for Tesla vehicles than Tesla is able to produce, which is an economic equation within itself that's way beyond the scope of this class or the scope of this lecture. But what is that number that Elon Musk and Tesla puts on their production to produce just enough cars in order to meet their goals or objectives, but not have the one extra unit of production, i.e., that one extra car roll off the production line that does not lead to a marginal diminishing of their production process. And the last thing I want to talk about, and this is very important, we're in section 5.5, and it talks about it in terms of economy of scope. Oftentimes we look at it on a much broader scale and we call it the economies of scale. So I'm going to use both those terms synonymous. Obviously, when we're talking about the economies of scope, we're really talking about the scope of the hospital, the scope of the unit of the hospital, or the product line, or the line of business. When we talk about it, let's say in manufacturing, we're talking about the ability of a producer to produce enough products at scale that they then become the low price producer of that product. And so they have something called an economy of scale, where the more products they produce, the less the production costs. And so if they were to produce, let's say, only 100 units, and I'm just making up numbers here, if they were producing 100 units, it would cost them $20 to produce the 100 units. But because they have an economy of scale, they can now produce as many units as they want. Why don't we say 100,000 units? And they can do that at the best cost. So in this case, maybe their cost drops down to $5. When we talk about economies of scope in healthcare, it's a similar process, except we're talking about clinical indicators and we're talking about specific interventions, if you will. And in that second paragraph under 5.5, where we talk about the production line, dimension of output should be distinguished from the case mix dimension. Case mix refers to the complexity of the types of diseases being treated. So a hospital can treat a large number of different diseases, has a different case mix than a specialist that only sees fewer types of patients, if you will. So if you look at Cancer Centers of America, and I know they're a privately owned hospital, their case mix specializes in cancer, even though there are many different types of cancer. Whereas if we look at just a regular hospital, if you will, a regular hospital will see all different types of case mix, including patients that have cancer. So two hospitals can have a very similar case mix, but have very different service scopes. So economies of scopes are savings that are derived from producing different products jointly or simultaneously in the same production unit rather than producing them individually or separately. You ever wondered, and I'm sure you have, and this has been a big deal here, on how you can never really compare apples to apples with hospitals. You'll have people that visit hospitals and they'll have similar procedures done, but when you look at that hospital bill, you can never compare apples to apples. Well, this is why. This is why, because different case mixes lead to different pricing. Different specialties lead to different cost, and savings are derived from um, the production of outputs, if you will, that are done jointly or simultaneously compared to situations where it's not, if you will. I know that under the Trump administration, they went to great lengths to pass laws on hospital transparency and pricing transparencies in hospitals. And hopefully, we'll start to see even better traction in that area. But if you really want to know why you cannot compare apples to apples when it comes to hospitals or clinics, then I would say do a deep dive on Section 5.5, Economies of Scope, and you should walk away with a better understanding. I'm kind of in the middle of the paragraph there where it says economies of scope might arise when some of the tasks involved in providing two distinct services are complementary. For example, I just recently brought some brand new glasses that are now broken. Yes, my brand new glasses are broken now. But I'm saying all of that to say, when I went to see the optometrist is in the same building as the people that are selling eyewear, but they weren't connected with each other as far as I know. I know that there's some stark laws there that says a physician cannot self-refer. But the optometrist is in the exact same building as the eyewear, the people selling eyewear. So when I went to the optometrist, I got my prescription and I said, well, what about my glasses? And as if I was going into a separate building, they said, oh, go right here to the people selling your eyeglasses. So again, economies of scope there when you've got complementary services there. Perhaps now you can build more profitability into the process. And then the final thing that we will talk about here, and yes, I do mean, final things here is we'll talk about long run curves and short run curves. So we've talked about the short run and how changes in the short run are often difficult. However, anything's possible in the long run, and the long run is usually 1 year or more. So for planning periods of sufficient length, such changes are possible, and the analysis of relevant issues are called long run analysis, and the factors are considered fixed from the perspective of the short term are no longer fixed in the long term, and they can vary. So from long-term planning perspectives, all resources are variable. Now that's in the long run, right? When we talk about the short run, it's different. So when we look at the average cost curve, when we look at the long run analysis, everything now becomes variable in the long run. If we look at figure 5.6, when we look at hospital admissions, not a lot of flexibility in the short run, but when we start looking at long run planning, long-term planning, or a year or more, then now hospital administrators can now design their outputs in order to maximize the inputs. So when we look at figure 5.6, for example, at 1,000 and 3,000 admissions, the long run analysis, the curve becomes associated with a different cost curve because it becomes more economically to produce successively greater outputs with large size plans. And in this case, you see an entire shift of the production curve. And finally, and I do mean finally this time, we talk about hospitals as an economy of scale. That's section 5.7. And we look at how each service has its own cost relationship, which may exhibit an economy of scale. However, at a multi-product hospital, your overall average cost will be higher than many smaller hospitals. So that's something that you want to think about. Also, the case mix and the service scope varies in types of hospitals. And so the net there, really what we're talking about in section 5.7 is even though you may be able to have pockets of economies of scales in hospital, maybe that you've got a good thing going in your labor and delivery department, if you will, maybe you've got some good stuff going in other divisions or other pockets of your hospital. When we look at the hospital as a whole, recent research suggests that there are no economies of scale, and even the smaller economies of scale that you do have within certain divisions or lines of business are usually negated by the larger diseconomy of scale of a hospital. So something to think about when you are creating your dissertations. And then under section 5.7, when we look at health insurance costs per policy, individual policies are more expensive to sell. And also, when insurance companies sell group plans to employers, employers perform many of the functions that insurance administrators perform, and thus that helps lower the cost of insurance for group plans. So there's a couple things there. Individual plans are more expensive than group plans. We already know that group plans can provide lower insurance rates because you have a larger risk pool and you can spread those costs out to many, many patients. That's what the whole idea of the PPACA was about, bringing younger people into the risk pool and then spreading out those costs, meaning that the healthy people pay for the unhealthy people, if you will. And then the last part there is that on individual plans, administrators have to do more work. But when they sell a group plan into a large organization, such as the company that I work for, Infosys, that has millions of people across the globe, the employees of Infosys perform a lot of the insurance maintenance and administrative functions that the insurance companies would usually perform, and thus that helps lower the overall cost of insurance as well. Okay, that's enough fun stuff, I think, for this lecture. Thanks for hanging there with me for almost an hour. Please email me if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. And I look forward to reading your assignments there for this unit. And I believe that we have a live session coming up pretty soon. So I look forward to connecting with you on that live session. But again, please don't hesitate to reach out to me with any questions, comments, or concerns. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Thank you, babe.